What a great welcome. Thank you guys. I really appreciate it. So we're going to get started here. So my presentation is World War II, War on the Homefront. So on September 1st, 1939, Hitler and Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany, starting what would become one of the most brutal wars in human history. In the beginning, this war went on for years without U.S. involvement. At the time, the United States was existing in a period of isolationism after the events of World War I. Most Americans believed at the time that getting involved in foreign wars had been a mistake. Although the U.S. had already quietly been supporting its allies in the war and quietly growing our military powers, officially the U.S. was still neutral. But that period of isolation and neutrality quickly came to an end on December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, a U.S. naval base in Hawaii, was attacked by Japanese forces. The intention was to destroy the U.S. fleet on the Pacific and to finally declare war with the United States. 3 days later, Germany and Italy also declared war on the U.S., and for the first time, the American people were united in one idea, an ideology of war. People were voluntarily signing up left and right to go fight for their country and for the freedom that she protected. This war was also being fought differently than any other war before it. Air battle was seen on a scale that it had never been thought of before. Dogfighting with smaller fighter planes, air raids, and bombings on huge targets in the heart of Germany were all unheard of at the time. Marine warfare also changed. German U-boats or submarines were sinking merchant ships and warships faster than they could be replaced by the end of 1941. Place yourselves briefly in the shoes of those who lived in the U.S. along the coast in 1941. There was a constant influx of news reports of Allied defeats and mass casualties. The war was raging, and the United States was trying to stay out of the fight, all while still supporting its allies from afar. Blackout orders were called for all along the coast, and they were put in place to protect our coastal citizens from German U-boat attacks, although Glynn County never really enforced those orders. In the early months of 1942, German U-boat 123, captained by Lieutenant Commander Reinhard Hartigan, was moving up and down the East Coast looking for merchant vessels to torpedo. U-123 met with 2 oil tankers just off our coast on April 8th near St. Simon's Island. Those tankers were the SS Oklahoma and the SO Baton Rouge. This is the SO Baton Rouge right here. Many crew members, U-123 torpedoed both of those ships and then set its sights on territory farther to the south. 22 crewmen died in this event. Many other crew members were rescued by the Coast Guard stationed on St. Simon's Island. For Glynn County, that was the closest, supposedly, that the Germans came to our sleepy little area. Lieutenant Commander Hartigan continued his campaign up the coast, and in a few short months, he was able to sink 22 other ships. The war affected the country in many ways. Yes, there was a severe lack in the workforce, and yes, the country still had not recovered from the experiences and devastating effects of the Great Depression. Something that came out of that was rationing. The OPA, or the Office of Price Administration, froze prices on most consumer goods in May of 1942. American citizens received ration stamps for those controlled goods, such as food, fuel, and shoes. Rationing involved putting limits on certain high-demand items like gasoline, shoes, food, and so much more. The government would issue a certain number of points or stamps to each person, and those points were then used along with money to purchase some goods. Can anyone guess what was the first item to be rationed in the United States? Sugar? Anyone else? Tires. Yeah, it was tires. I thought that was really interesting. World War II was a tumultuous event that changed the world in so many ways. It is often referred to as a war on 2 fronts. I happen to think it's a war on 3. The fight raged on in Europe and the Pacific, and it was a hard-fought battle that many involved thought would never end. Here at home, the fight had a different tone. It was a feeling of purpose, a reason to come together in the face of incredible odds. It was a battle to produce goods faster than the Axis powers could destroy them. before we get into the wonderful ways that Glynn County got involved in the war effort, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the end of the Jekyll Island Club and how the island was used after the millionaires left with most of their belongings. The image on the screen is an aerial photograph of the Jekyll Island Club in the 1940s. The blimp up top in the corner is a naval blimp that was traveling over here from Glencoe Air Station in Brunswick. Jekyll in this picture looks quiet and pretty picturesque, if you ask me. Looks like a fun place to vacation. Jekyll faced quite a bit of hardship before the war broke out. The stock market crash and the subsequent Great Depression cost the small private hunting club most of its membership. Member fees at this time were more expensive than most could afford, and many could not or did not want to keep paying for their membership to a Victorian club that they could only use 3 months out of the year. Of course, the crash and the Great Depression were not the only downfalls of the Jekyll Island Club. It was having a hard time even in the early 20s keeping up with the changing world that no longer had those old Victorian ideals. Though people were on Jekyll during the outbreak of World War II, life on the island for a few of the members that remained after the Great Depression had not changed much, with the exception of the amount of staff that they had. They were going on about their daily activities, such as going on drives, walking on the beaches, getting their hair and nails done, and having tea and dinner with their friends. This is shown in the diary entries of Marion B. Maurice when she kept a report of her daily activities on Jekyll in 1941. It seems like the war going on in Europe and in the Pacific did not take up any free real estate in the minds of some of our members. The club president at the time, Vernon Prentice, and Bill Jones of Sea Island often conversed during this time period. Letters we have seen occasionally mention the war raging in Europe, but it was never the main topic of conversation. Jekyll had bigger problems than the war to deal with. The club was facing closure, and it was barely able to make ends meet. At this time, the club had been facing difficulties on many sides. There was a staff shortage, as employees were either off fighting in the war, working in the shipyards in Brunswick, or doing what they could to support the war effort at home. After the Great Depression, the club had as few as 10 members, including the Maurice family, the Goulds, the Jenningses, and a few members of the Annex Association. The cost of keeping the doors open was becoming too great, and many members were not paying taxes on their private properties. By the time that the state purchased Jekyll in 1947, the club owed over $500,000 in back taxes. The whole island was sold for $675,000. And after the Jekyll Island Club closed at the end of its 1942 season, the island saw some other visitors. The Coast Guard Beach Patrol occasionally came to Jekyll to patrol the beaches and watch for German U-boats. So this photo up here, you see some of our lovely Coast Guard members on horseback with dogs. I think that's a really great picture. So they came over on barge and from Brunswick and St. Simons and would patrol our beaches. According to Doree Avera, the granddaughter of James D. Polk, a commanding officer in the 6th Naval District, on nearby Jekyll Island, the millionaire landowners of the Jekyll Island Club were told to leave for their safety. The beach patrol moved in. Horses were brought over by barge from Brunswick and housed in the stables. The patrolmen were now living in the servants' quarters. We determined those to be the dormitories. The horses were kept in this very building and in Baker Crane Carriage House. Although some of the statement is not quite true, the island was not ordered to be emptied. The reason behind it was not to protect the millionaires. The real reason was to be able to build some secret towers on the island. A few radar towers and observation towers seen on this slide were placed along the beaches. So in this photo, you've got up here in the top corner, you'll see the radar tower that was placed here on Jekyll Island. It was a big secret at the time. And over here, you'll see one of the observation towers behind this beautiful woman and her plane. So both of these photos are from the mid to late 1950s. This one is possibly 1960. We're not actually sure, we just have a date range. You'll notice a very picturesque beach after the state purchased the island and it was free use for everybody. And as I mentioned, in the background behind this lovely lady, you'll see a lovely observation tower. There were quite a few of those on Jekyll Island. Some of them were closer to beach accesses than others. On the home front, radar technology was being used to help triangulate where German U-boats were in our local waters and farther out to sea. Jekyll Island was one of many secret locations with towers used in that triangulation along our coast. A story was shared about Jekyll in the Memories from the Marshes of Glynn World War II book. The story discusses a utilities transmission engineer and their encounter with the Coast Guard stationed here on Jekyll Island. This engineer and his assistant had been working in Savannah, Georgia, when he received a call to go down to Jekyll and lay a new transmission cable. It apparently had been cut and needed replacing. The assistant set up the landline on the Brunswick side of the cable, and the engineer took a barge over from Brunswick to Jekyll with the help of its captain. And by their arrival time, it had already become dark outside. The captain and the engineer began unloading the equipment for the new cable and started to make their way through the marsh to the radar tower. Both men were dressed in civilian clothes at the time. Along the way, the engineer was approached from behind by a member of the Coast Guard who happened to be patrolling the island that evening. The radar point on Jekyll happened to be one of the most secretive things that the government had at the time, which is why there were beach patrols in the first place on Jekyll. The engineer had to show the rest of the patrol members all of his equipment and so that they would not arrest him. A few sailors on the island and caretakers were the only inhabitants on Jekyll Island after 1942. A group of Sea Scouts went to Jekyll with the Coast Guard and were able to stay in the hotel under the caretaker's supervision. They mentioned that the furnishings had been left behind were extremely lavish and they were very lucky. All right, so let's shift our gears just a little bit. We're going to discuss Brunswick and how she was shaped by the war on the home front. Brunswick before World War II was a sleepy little town with fewer than 20,000 residents. It had seen a small moment of growth during the 1910s and had been described as a bunch of small depression towns that called this area home. Brunswick was selected by the Maritime Commission to host a shipbuilding effort, and by the end of 1942, the United States and allied countries were in such a dire need of cargo vessels that the U.S. Maritime Commission, or USMC, issued an emergency program to construct the EC2SC1, better known as the Liberty Ship or Victory Ship. The United States Maritime Commission chose 18 locations across the country. Georgia hosted 2 locations, one in Brunswick and one in Savannah. Other shipbuilding locations were in North Carolina, Florida, New York, and so on. Brunswick was chosen for a few reasons. The South Yard, located today next to the Sydney Linear Bridge, was initially the location of the railroad Birmingham-Atlanta Atlantic Line. This made the shipyard's location perfect because it already had pre-laid tracks. The company was then able to move large parts of metal and equipment near the water. It was also what we called a natural harbor. A natural harbor means that the water is deep enough for large vessels and it is not shaped by humans. Deep water access was key for the building and moving of such large vessels. The need for these Liberty ships was declared an emergency, and large amounts were ordered to be built along the west and east coasts. The purpose was to replace the cargo vessels that had been sunk by the German U-boats across the Atlantic. The Allies were in short supply of munitions, tanks, and much more by the time the U.S. Maritime Commission ordered these Liberty ships to be built. The North Yard was used prior to World War I and was briefly used to make a handful of ships for that war out of wood. It was then designated for use in World War II to build yard oilers, seen over on the right side. And those were intended to refuel larger vessels out on the open ocean. They also produced 100 tugboats to accompany the larger vessels out into the open ocean. The South Yard was constructed by the Daniel Construction Corporation for the Brunswick Marine Construction Corporation. They planned and started building the yard with 6 shipways, allowing 6 Liberties to be built simultaneously. 3 buildings for manufacturing were also built, and 1 still stands today. The first building to be completed at the South Yard was the bow loft, where templates for the ship were drawn up and sized on metal sheets. Before the shipyard's completion and the completion of the first Liberty, the Brunswick Marine Construction Corporation lost their contract to the J.A. Jones Construction Company of North Carolina. And the story claims that the switch occurred due to poor management. I think it's because they didn't build their first ship in time. Now that we've talked a little bit about both yards, let's talk about the ships themselves. So this photo right here is of hull 134. And it is one of the first ships that were built at the Brunswick shipyard. And this is the keel that has been laid. And I think it's fascinating. This is the farthest shipyard to the left side of the lanes, and then you can see where the other ones are being built simultaneously next to it. The Liberty ship was a special kind of cargo ship classified as the EC2S C1. These were emergency cargo steam-powered vessels. The E stands for emergency, C2 is a classification of the size of the ship in the C1, C2, C3, and C4 size range, C4 being the largest. The final C1 is in reference to the unmodified original British C1 design. These ships were not built to be quick, but to carry large loads consisting of tanks, munitions, food, and crew across the Atlantic. Across the Atlantic, in the Gulf of Mexico, and the Pacific Oceans. They needed to be able to carry roughly 10,000 tons of cargo. This was all in accordance with the Lend-Lease program that the United States had issued in order to help our allies fight the war prior to getting heavily involved. These ships were to be 450 feet in length and 7 feet of beam. The beam of a ship is its width at the widest point. The ships needed to be built faster than the Germans could sink them, and that is exactly what happened. In total, there were 2,710 across 18 cities, and only 200 Liberty ships were sunk during the entire war. In Georgia alone, about 200 vessels were built for this war effort, and 99 of them were built here in Brunswick. A staggering total of 16,000 to 17,000 people were employed at the Brunswick shipyards by the middle of 1943. The two Brunswick yards worked so hard to produce as many ships as they could in such a short amount of time. Once the ships were completed and they were ready for their voyages, they received a christening with a bottle of champagne and a name. Although the names and numbers were never painted on the ships, they still needed the fanfare that went with a ship launching for good luck. The purpose for not naming the ships was to confuse the Axis powers in the Atlantic. The ships were virtually unidentifiable, and they were also coined ugly ducklings by President Roosevelt. Oh, before I switch, we'll talk about the photos. So this is an entire shift at the J.A. Jones shipyard in 1943. Each of the shipyards ran in shifts of 3. So you had an AM shift, a lunchtime shift, and an all-night shift. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And that is one of our Liberty ships setting off after it was being completed. While many young and able men left to go fight in the war, Brunswick was full of people wanting to support the troops overseas. There were so many people flocking to work at the shipyards that housing became an issue. Glynn County residents early on were encouraged to rent any spare rooms in their homes to anyone. Brunswick continued to grow during the years that the war raged on. The yards were operating in 3-shift systems that meant the work was being done 24/7. With the incredible numbers of people working at the shipyards, there needed to be more places for these workers to sleep. Brunswick was quickly running out of space to house the workers coming from all over the South to work, and war apartments were quickly built. Women were thrown into the workforce, taking over jobs traditionally held by men. The women initially were hired to do clerical work, but due to the need for manual labor, women began to do other hard labor jobs. And this began shifting the views of labor after the war. This new movement of women in the workforce allowed for changes not only in that day and age, but also post-World War II. Women during World War II were now able to work in factories with heavy machinery. They were welders, particularly those that worked here at our shipyards. They had acquired the skills to do many labor-intensive jobs, and they were really good at them. After the war ended, many women wanted to go back to work after experiencing out-of-the-house jobs that required skilled labor for the first time. It was these amazing women who wanted to do more for their country that helped the Allied forces to win the war. The J.A. Jones Company employed nearly 2,000 women out of the 17,000 employees. Something else unheard of at the time occurred here at our shipyards. African Americans were getting the same pay as their white counterparts. The African American population began flocking to Brunswick to find good paying work. Segregation was still part of daily life in the South, but here in Brunswick, the rules of segregation were a lot more relaxed. Brunswick hired more African American workers than any other nearby shipyard in the 3 connecting states. Their work was so substantial that the Brunswick Yard was the only yard in the South to allow them unionization. So this photo is some of our lovely women who worked at the J.A. Jones shipyard. So most of them are welders, which I think is really fascinating. The shipyards were not the only place Brunswick was involved in the war. Glynn Air Station was built farther inland and was used as a naval base. It was built in September of 1942, and it was used to house blimps used for spotting submarines. They conducted several anti-submarine patrols along our coast, and many would also go far out to sea to scout for U-boats. Navy blimps escorted over 89,000 surface ships without losing a single one. This is one of the air hangars that the blimps were housed in. I really wish they were still around because they are an architectural wonder. So we're going to switch gears again and talk a little bit about St. Simons. St. Simons Island for years was a small town and vacation spot in our beautiful Golden Isles. In 1942, parts of the island were taken over by the armed forces, and some of those locations you might know fairly well. Many hotels and other buildings were used to house and train members of the armed forces and those entering into the civilian volunteer positions. The King and Prince Hotel was taken over and used as a location to train in the use of radar location. If you look at the screen on the right, you will see, to my right, you will see 2 images. If you look closely, you'll notice 2 towers in front of the King and Prince, and those are radar towers. They were used to help triangulate the information from far out at sea and Jekyll Island, and they triangulated all of that information out to all of the local Navy air bases. So St. Simons McKinnon Airport and Glynn Naval Air Station. The second image is an aerial shot of the beach of St. Simons on the north end from a plane in the 1940s. The Cloister Administration Building was used for civilian spotter training. The Navy would bring a screen and a projector and show the various planes that might be seen along our coast. Some were friendlies and some were enemies. Although there was never an enemy plane ever spotted on our coast, our civilian spotters were ready to make that call. For those that could not join the armed forces and those that were not allowed to join, many joined groups such as the Early Warning Aircraft Service as volunteers. They were trained to spot Axis power planes. They were also referred to as spotters, and they all logged the planes that they saw during their watches in the observation towers. Those logs were then reported to a regional military base, most likely St. Simons Airport or Glynn. There's a great example of this over at the St. Simons Homefront Museum if y'all have not already been there. The small McKinnon Airport we know today was used as a training base for the Air Force. It was renamed Naval Air Station St. Simons and was first used as a pilot training center for the Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters. That is one of the Grumman F-4F Wildcat planes. The Wildcats, among many other planes, were instrumental in the air battle going on in our wars. These smaller fighter planes were used to help escort our B-29 bomber groups over Europe. The Coast Guard had a new station built under the New Deal. Shown on the screen, you can see that it looks similar to a lot of other Coast Guard stations. The wartime mission of our Coast Guard was to protect America's shorelines and to perform maritime rescues. Our St. Simon Station organized beach patrols, and those were held all over the Golden Isles to detect suspicious vessels in our waters. Our Coast Guard was instrumental in the sense of safety for civilians in the area. They did regular patrols, worked often with the local communities, and kept a watchful eye on the enemy abroad. To finish up a topic that I could probably discuss indefinitely with many facets, I'd like to take a look at what happened after the war came to an end. The armed forces left our area, and the beaches were open again to the public. The state purchased Jekyll Island from the Jekyll Island Club for not enough money, if you ask me. But, what do I know? And our sleepy little town returned to its sleepy roots. Some families who relocated to work in the shipyards and in Brunswick stayed. Many left and returned to their farms or family businesses if they were able to reopen them. Women now had the ability to work jobs that had only been given to men prior to the war, and they were ready to get back into the workforce. On the screen, you will see two images, one of the ship lanes today and one of the warehouse that still stands next to the Sydney Linear Bridge. Both are remnants of a time that can only be explained as a powerful unity. The war on the home front changed a lot for this area and brought so much rich history for each of us to enjoy. I'm sure you're thinking, wow, this girl knows a lot about World War II and a lot about ships, and I do. But because without the liberties, there would be no D-Day, no invasion of Europe, and possibly a devastating outcome for the war. Thank you all for listening to my talk. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
So what made the whole thing on Jekyll so secretive?
So they just did not want people knowing that there was a radar tower. That was mostly for the German U-boats, because if they knew it was there, they would try to cut it down.
And what made it safer? Why did they not keep it secret on St. Simon's then?
So they couldn't, excuse me, my brain is not working yet. The King and Prince was widely known as a base, and it was widely known as a place that they were being trained to use radar, and so it couldn't be kept a secret then, so that was a point of contention for a while.
And did it stay secret through the whole war on Jekyll?
No, it didn't, but they sure tried.
Okay.
Yeah.
My dad was a dock foreman for J.A. Jones during the war, and he said in Christmas of '44 they forego a week's pay.
They did.
Are you familiar with that?
I am, yeah. They worked for free on Christmas, and everyone who worked on that day donated their entire paycheck, which I thought was really incredible.
Think about doing that today.
I don't think people would.
Even the Canadians couldn't do it.
Yeah.
There was a novel written fairly recently about the shipyard, and it talked about sabotage that was happening in the shipyard, and I was just wondering if that was really happening or whether that was part of fiction of the book.
So as far as I know, that was fiction, but I just focused mainly on the building of the ships and not the inner workings of the shipyard. For my thesis, I did a little bit more research for this presentation in terms of St. Simon's and Jekyll, but as far as I know, no, but that might have been why the Brunswick Marine Construction Corporation lost their contract.
Wow.
Yeah.
Are there any Liberty ships still around?
There are, yes. There is one that's still floating, and it lives in Maryland. It is the USS John B. Woods, I think. And you can take tours of it. Yeah.
Were German submarines detected off the shore of Georgia?
They were, yes. After the SO Baton Rouge and the SS Oklahoma were sunk, they weren't really around as often anymore, but they were still outside of our waters, just not as close inland. Yeah.
And were they both sunk on the same night?
They were. Mm-hmm. They were just a few miles apart. Yeah.
Who owns that property now?
I don't know. I know that there's a house over there, and I think they're still trying to do a subdivision that's like a live-work situation. I think that was in the news today.
It was
Yes.
Residents
It would be a,
There were 300 lots.
Yeah.
And they are holding an auction on a certain number of them because there have been no taxes paid.
that is such a shame. Yeah.
Did you ever hear about taking a Liberty ship, filling it with ping pong balls, and actually arming it, but hiding all the arms so the submarine would surface to shoot it, and then they would attack with deck guns? Dan told me about this.
No, but I need to learn about that. That's very cool.
Because it was full of
Yeah, yeah. I believe it. All right. Is that it? Does anyone else have anything? Yeah.
How fast, how much time it took to build like a Liberty ship?
So in the beginning, it took about a year to finish 3. And by the end of the shipyard building under J.A. Jones, they built 6 in 1 month. Yeah.
Where is that building? Is that what you see when you just cross?
It is, yeah. So the words are on the left side of the building if you're driving over the bridge. They're all the way on the left side. So it's still being used as a manufacturing warehouse of some sort. I did go over there, and when I took these pictures in college, they yelled at me and told me to leave. So it is being used. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it.